I'm Laura Bieger. I'm professor for American Studies, Political Culture and Theory at the University of Groningen. And my current research focuses on the reading public as an important democratic institution, and on particularly also the role that literature can play in summoning reading publics into being. And that also drew me to the 1619 project, which I think is also a literary project. It's a very artistic project, and it doesn't only contain works of literature and works of art, but one can look at it as a work of engaged literature in its own right. So that is basically my approach to this.
Excellent. And I think the first question I would have you answer is your essay basically looks at the 1619 project as a collection of essays, which it is, but then maybe if you could talk about how those essays interact, and then also how they, well, the second part will be kind of the public engagement part.
Mm-hmm.
I think first, if we talk about your argument about kind of what the essays do.
Yeah. So when I first came across the 1619 project, I was intrigued by its politics, and I guess we'll talk more about its politics later, but I was also super intrigued by its form, by its flashiness, by its playfulness, by the sophisticated way in which it is put together, and it works across different media and engages different, or uses different forms, different media forms, and also different essays and artworks and so on to reach a high level of public engagement. And I thought, wow, that's really fascinating, given my my particular research interests. And so obviously it draws on the tradition of the essay. And the essay has a long history of being used for public engagement. And we can also talk more about that. But you know, one obvious thing to note about the 1619 project is that it consists of essays, that it has lots of individual essays that are its backbone, if you will. But my idea was, when I looked at the entire also multimedia scope of the whole things, wait, doesn't the whole thing kind of function like an essay? And for that, one has to bear in mind that the essay is, of course, stems from the world of letters, was invented by Montaigne, also with a very particular purpose, and kind of elaborating in a personal mode on issues of more general concern. But it also has a long history in other media, like film, for instance. And so there we already can make a step into different, also different art forms and different media. And I was so intrigued by the 1619 project to really kind of think of the whole thing with all its moving parts, right? Not only the published pieces in the magazine, but also those on the website and the podcast and like all the various materials, as creating, you know, kind of a really an expansive work of art that has as its goal to engage the public in a particular way, and that functions, in my understanding, as an essay does.
Right, and I think that was one of the most interesting parts for me, was the fact that like the website's interactivity and the podcast's discussion format, you know, you kind of link to this idea that the essay itself is kind of a closed system, in that, you know, and this is where you bring in the Theodore Adorno, where, you know, so maybe you could just briefly kind of give us an overview of your argument of what the essay does.
Yeah. I mean, I'm drawing in particular, or I'm drawing, if you will, on two different traditions in thinking about the essay. And one is Montaigne. I already mentioned that, and this is also a tradition that is especially prominent and powerful in US American culture, and that is the personal essay, right? And the way that the essay uses the personal as a mode of exploring issues of common concern. And this is especially powerful, also powerful political weapon in the African American intellectual tradition, right? When one thinks of James Baldwin, Richard Wright, the essay, the political essay really had its strong moment in the 50s and then onwards from that, but, you know, more recent, Ta-Nehisi Coates and, you know, Teju Cole and so on. So the essay really has a very, you know, like strong and important place in the Black intellectual tradition. And the personal, you know, the authority of the personal speaking from personal experience, but then linking that to these issues of larger concerns. And I think this is so powerful also in Nicole Hannah-Jones's lead essay of the 1619 Project. And it becomes even more powerful, I think, the personal in the podcast, because the podcast is a medium that really thrives on bringing out, you know, the power of the personal. So there's that, but an argument that I make in the piece that I wrote about the essay in the digital age, why I consider the 1619 Project really as a prototype of that, is that I say, well, but the personal essay alone, or the tradition of the personal essay alone is not enough to explain what is going on and what is powerful and what is so intriguing about how the 1619 Project works. And there I bring in more the German intellectual tradition, Frankfurt School tradition, with Adorno and Lukács and Max Bense, a thinker who's lesser known than the others, or more known among film scholars, because he actively, or he thought about the essay in ways that makes it, you know, makes the leap to the medium of film, and it's kind of basically montage structure, you know, is very conducive to kind of making arguments like that. And so what they argue is they also, for them, it's also, the essay also affords the mode of the personal, but it's a way of thinking that is, like one famous quote from Adorno, for instance, is the essay thinks in fragments, right? So it's not, it is meandering, it's not straightforward. It tries things out in a way also that uses things to leap off to making more general claims about that phenomenon and so on. So in the German intellectual tradition, there is a way of thinking about the essay as a philosophical tradition, as a way of thinking that thrives on being fragmentary, on being kind of collage-like, on being recurring in its arguments and so on. And so Adorno famously described this, you know, when he thought about the art of the essay. And for him, the essay really has a particular form, and that form is, you know, I just described those very elements, and they invite a particular kind of thinking. For Adorno, famously, this was also a powerful form in which to conduct ideology criticism, because it is in itself fractured, and in that sense, it also kind of it questions authority in a very powerful way. So maybe I can leave it at that for now.
Well, I'm not going to let you leave it at that, because I think we the 1619 Project has been accused of many things, but I think one of the things it does so effectively is that it does bring forth this acknowledgement of white supremacy in American culture, and therefore is challenging an ideology. And I know you don't talk about it in the paper, but you know, it might be interesting if you have any thoughts on kind of well, I guess we can move into the political now, as far as what do you think the 1619 is doing with its essays, and, you know, how well does it accomplish it?
Well, I had really interesting debates about the argument that I'm making about the form of the 1619 Project with some colleagues, because some of them challenge me in saying, well, aren't you forcing that argument about the German intellectual tradition onto a format that is actually less open? Like, one of the idea about, that this form kind of is, or the openness of the form, also allows a certain kind of openness in thinking about the topics to which the essay turns. And so, so here some colleagues just really kind of challenged, or pressured me in a very productive way. And the question is like, is the 1619 project as open in its, the way in which it wants to think about the problem as you claim it is? And so for me, that was the most interesting kind of debate that I had with colleagues about this, because first of all, I think that the openness of the Frankfurt School folks is also not as radical as they claim. They also have premises about the arguments that they wanted to make, and the arguments that would kind of then count as open and philosophically viable, and so on. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that, yes, there is a clear kind of trajectory in, precisely what you said, in challenging white supremacy. But at the same time, I also think, at least that's my reading, it doesn't, it's still, the essay is also, the form of the essay wants to irritate, it wants to unsettle, but it doesn't want to kind of produce closure again. And in my reading, that's also what the 1619 project, in confronting a history in a particular way and then challenging, a certain way of telling that history, it wants to disrupt rather than already give answers, to these issues. So, I would in those debates always, defend the kind of aesthetic politics, if you will, of the 1619 project along these lines, that yes, there is a certain, obviously, an agenda that it wears on its sleeve, but it's not about, it's more about raising questions than about giving answers. And I think that, that I would read that as a commitment to that particular openness. Yes.
Yeah, and I think the raising questions leads us to, or leads me at least, to thinking about kind of your argument about the political agency and discussion of the essay. So one of the things that has happened in our discussion group here is that we've had to extend it out. So after dealing with the articles, it's led to new fragments and new kind of inclusions. And I think one of the things that, as in the openness and then the argument creating the space for public discourse, I think is, what I think we should discuss next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about it?
Well, I think like the political agency argument that you kind of make, which says that, it's on page 20, which I'm thinking of, that the use of the essay form lies in its capacity to unsettle and disrupt, which we've talked a little bit about. But then, the horrors of history and the, bringing, the expansive capacity for self-reflection and public engagement. Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that's been most disappointing in the public debates surrounding the 1619 project is that they focus on one or two things in one essay, which is the Hannah Jones essay. And they don't treat it as an essay, they treat it as a historical rendering, and kind of skip over the really powerful impact of her father's story. And I guess that, focus, or laser focus on one side and kind of not ignorance, but ignoring the real power of it. Because when we talk about it in our group, that story just elicits forth all these personal stories of how how people dealt with similar issues of American patriotism versus this, oppressive system that African Americans have lived under. So I guess the argument is, how do you think that it functions politically? Or the question I have is, do you think it's an effective tool the way it is structured? Or are there criticisms that could be leveled against it?
I think there are many different layers to that question. I think it, as that work of journalism that uses the essay in this expansive way in order to create a space, to create an opening, create a space of reflection. I think it's an incredibly successful, incredibly compelling format. And the backlash that you got from historians is, I think, or also the defense that you got from some historians, the debate that it evoked among historians, I think, is a powerful really powerful indication of how well it works. And I think what is also fascinating about it, and this is also something that I talk about in my piece, is that one of its, or a particular strength of it, is how it doesn't shy away from a certain also aesthetics of commodification, right? It's very consumable, and it's consumable in different ways. It's consumable. The magazine is already kind of part of that. The magazine is is a very consumable journalistic format that is more playful, more more colorful in its fonts and layout and so on, and it makes use of of this kind of aesthetics of commodification, and kind of welds that with a political agenda in very powerful and evocative ways. It does that in the next step also, that level of engagement that is playful without being apolitical, right? Then in the step to the website and the step to the podcast and so on. So it is very good at kind of engaging the public by also offering something that is enjoyable to consume. That's also hard to consume. With enjoyable, I don't mean that's only pleasurable, because listening to the podcast is hard. Right? Many of the episodes you're not done with them and you feel good, but the intensity, the sheer intensity, in which this particular medium engages you, in these various stories that are told, is entertaining, right? In that way, it has a high entertainment level, and I think the whole project is extremely good. And you also, of course, get the the power, the capacity of the New York Times behind that. So I would say on that level, it is extremely well done. It's extremely sophisticated. Its content is extremely, you really have such amazing contributors. It's just so very well done. It's amazing how well done it is, right? And how creative it is, and how beautiful it is, and how versatile it is, and all of that, right? It's just an amazing, and I think that was what drew my attention to it in the first place. Then you have other questions. Then you have the questions like, what is the New York Times doing with this, right? And the New York Times, one of the leading newspapers, the New York Times, and this was before a certain kind of activist journalism, just really kind of spark debate, about what journalism could do and should do and shouldn't do and so on. But here, you have an interesting form of, what you could call an activist journalism, a journalism that very clearly, that's not about, objective reporting, but about taking sides and, using that entire power of the New York Times in order to intervene in a debate. I think in a debate that is very important to be had, but that's something that I think that's remarkable, right? It's really remarkable that the New York Times is doing that, while the New York Times is at the same time under attack for, a racially biased kind of reporting. And there have been artists like Alexandra Bell who spotlighted that recently and so on. So it's also an interesting, kind of, you could almost say, PR campaign on behalf of the New York Times to engage readers, and also engage readers at a time when the business model of newspapers is changing more and more to subscriber-driven journalism, and less, away from an advertisement-driven and toward a subscriber-driven journalism. So, I think there are interesting kind of shifts also in the practice of journalism that the 1619 project sheds light on. And there's an interesting, I think, division of labor here between the more traditional, section of the newspaper, and only one article about baseball and, ownership in baseball is affiliated with the 1619 project, but part of the regular pages of the newspaper. Whereas the rest is, kind of on the beautiful fringes, of the newspaper. And, I'm not like, this is polemic, obviously, because, the magazine is not really, firmly established part, but it's still not the core, of the daily journalism. And so it's interesting, right? Because the 1619 project, in a way, spearheaded, a certain development in the practice of journalism. And it also crystallizes, certain issues that are going on. And I think these are more problematic. I think there is a lot at stake, in the debate right now about how activist journalism should or shouldn't be. I think that's a really important political debate that's going on right now, especially when it comes to the issue of, public deliberation and the role that the free press should play in that, and so on.
Right, and it's interesting too, because the debate, at least seems to be focused on, or at least was under the previous United States president, over whether it's good press or bad press, and we either like it or we don't like it. So it was, if someone's doing hard journalism and reporting facts, we can choose not to, accept those facts if we don't like them. And I think that's a lot of what's happened with the 1619 project. Also, the fact that it kind of bubbled up at the same time as all this other, race debate in America during the pandemic. So it was, and then the conservatives do a great job of keeping it in the news, which helps me for my program, but is its own problem. So I think this is a great talk, and I think one of the important things I wanted to bring with talking to you is that there is this. I wanted to kind of include this next level of thinking about it, because I've talked to a lot of historians. David Wall Streeter said, in many ways, the 1619 debate among historians has taken their business into the street. So the stuff that they would argue about in their offices and in their departments are now being kind of thrust out into the public discourse. And he is saying that is an interesting development in and of itself, because you're seeing the practitioners of history and how they interpret things. So there's a lot going on with it. But
well, maybe one maybe already final thought, I don't know, maybe that raises, but one thing that I find so important to bear in mind when thinking about also what's at stake here, with public debate, how the 1619 project, tried to intervene in public debate and did this, in a particular fashion, and so on, is that that really sheds light on a media system, on the media system in which, public debate, public deliberation, can take place. And this is also a point that I make in my piece, but I think it's really worth reiterating that in the US, in the absence of a publicly funded media system, public discourse took shape, within capitalist mass media. A capitalist logic, of seeking attention, of profit making, all of that is ingrained in US political discourse from the beginning. That's very different. For instance, in Germany, where I'm from, in Britain with the BBC system and so on, they're very different. And that means that there is a certain kind of, logic of, like capitalist logic kind of ingrained. And it didn't enter the public sphere. There was never a pure, a pure public sphere that was not, functioning under this logic. And that, I think you see that also in how effective the 1619 project is in its form, and how effective it also is in being radically political at the same time than being, super versatile and kind of, like participating in that kind of discourse. So I think that's the one thing. And I think that also, just really clearly sets this form of the essay apart from a Frankfurt School suspicion against, modern / capitalist mass media. That logic is already ingrained in the logic of the essay, because the essay is a form, of deliberation that is shaped by the very media that are also, at least in different cultures, but at least in the US, particularly, have evolved in this context. But the thing that I keep thinking about or puzzling over is how activist journalism kind of feeds a logic of polarization. I think that is really, and that's maybe also a good note to end on, because public debate, I think when public debate kind of enters a logic of polarization, and you see that, I think right now with a vaccination, right, whether it be vaccination or non-vaccination, once again becomes an issue of a partisan issue, right? And that's absolutely absurd, right? I mean, why should, whether you are a Republican or Democrat, why should that matter in your stance on vaccination? But once public discourse kind of falls prey to that logic of polarization, it is very difficult to to have just really reasonable exchange of arguments. And I think that is just really the danger, with a shift from an objectivity is, that's a philosophical debate in its own right, but a shift toward an activist journalism risks to feed a logic of polarization that is already, I think, the biggest challenge for democracy and social well-being in the US as it stands right now. And so I think that is just the I think the most pressing issue that the kind of journalism that the 1619 Project stands for also raises, even though I totally share its politics, right? But if we step back from it, there is something at stake that is potentially very dangerous, I think.